Hi, welcome to the virtual edition of the BMO IFFSA Toronto 2020 and our discussion on contemporary film music composition. I'm here with my colleague Benedict Taylor,
Hi.
and my name is Naren Chandavarkar, and we've been working as a composition duo in the Indian film industry for the last 11 years. We've worked on projects more recently, such as web series like Patal Lok and Betal, as well as the feature film Chintu Ka Birthday. And in the past have worked on projects such as Udta Punjab, Ship of Theseus, Killa, Sonchiria, Newton, Gurgaon, and the Canadian film Black Kite. We've been asked to talk about, we've been kindly invited to this talk by Anup Singh and Sunny Gill, and we've been asked to talk about our approach to music, finding our own music, working in contemporary film, and how we see things changing, and what we would envision as changes for the future. So in beginning, talking about our approach to music, I thought it might be nice to start with how we first started working together and what drew us to collaborate, and perhaps building first from what our backgrounds in music are. So, Benedict, do you want to talk a little bit about your background?
Sure, yeah. So I studied, come from originally an entirely Western classical background, learning violin and viola at a young age, and then going on to study at the Royal Northern College of Music in Manchester, performance as a violist, followed by time away, but then time back at University of London Goldsmiths College, reading ethnomusicology, and working as a freelance musician, and gradually finding my way increasingly into contemporary music, modern music performance, some experimental musics, and a lot of time with free improvisation, improvised music, and my own experimentation through composing and things like that. Yeah, that's my rough background, I suppose.
Yeah, and my background is I studied music as a child, playing guitar and piano for a few years. But then I didn't go on to study after that. I studied literature in college, and my introduction to composing for music was mostly tinkering around on the computer. And then through that, I was working first as an actor. And in that process, started working as a music supervisor for theater shows, picking music for plays to work on. And through that, started composing music for plays. And while that happened, one of the first projects I worked on where I'd composed original music for a play was a play called Skeleton Woman, which Anurag Kashyap produced. And he, seeing the music for that play, he'd invited me to score the music for That Girl in Yellow Boots. And when that had happened, his feature film, That Girl in Yellow Boots. And when that happened, I invited Benedict, whom I had met when he was teaching in Mumbai at the Meli Mehta College. Meli Mehta Institute.
Music Foundation.
Music Foundation, sorry. And I reached out to him to collaborate. And the reason I reached out was despite having very different musical backgrounds and not really having worked together before, I think we'd found already that we had a shared idea of how music worked. I mean, a shared relationship with music. We had a lot of musical tastes in common. I think when we first met, we discovered very diverse tastes, from listening to classical music such as Shostakovich, which finally had picked for a play, and discovered that the quartet that I had picked had Benedict's chamber music teacher.
Playing
on it. Yeah,
that's
Fitzwilliam quartet, right?
Yeah. The lead violinist of the Fitzwilliam quartet was known for recording the Shostakovich quartets, and you were doing the play, and I remember watching the play in Mumbai and listening and thinking, I think that sounds really familiar. And I was like, recording the Fitzwilliam quartet. I was like, that's my old teacher.
Yeah. Another funny coincidence was you lived on Friendly Street and I was living on Yadi Road. But
that's right.
Anyways. And anyway, so then we also got on well. So it felt like it would have been a fun process, which is something I think that has been important for us through our entire working relationship. And also, I think once we'd worked together on improv, improving music for a theater play, which I was acting in. And I saw the way that you worked. And I think this is important later on, tying into our working process, which was that, composition then was quite daunting for me, especially the more technical aspects of it, because I just started learning. And you just seeing a way by which you could improvise and just work by doing, and watching the way you did that it was very freeing for me, where I was this ability to interact with someone who had a very deep and technical as well as technical knowledge of music, but without having to be technical. And that was very liberating, and that there was this immediate shared understanding where you could collaborate immediately by doing things and also eventually get into technical areas, but that wasn't the governing language. It was more about a more practical way of just doing things, getting things done. Sorry, carry on.
I mean, for me also, because I think that I remember coming and doing that. It's interesting because it was only a small bit, because I wasn't around very long at that time. So we did, I think, maybe one session or something, but we were friends anyway. But the relationship, being able to approach from my angle as well, coming from that classical perspective, but having worked into the improvised music world or whatever, to meet someone who was open to going down those rabbit holes and those alleyways straight off the bat. So that, again, in the same sort of way, it was kind of like, well, this will work. This is gonna, this could happen. So, and that's, which is half. Well, no, more half. How do you define? It's an awful lot of what I look for in making modern music or improvised music anyway, is kind of beyond whether I must work with certain pianists. It's more, who are you trying to work with? So that kind of was there, and immediately for me, I think, is how we spark things off.
So, I mean, we pretty much started working then, which was in 2009, I think, and we've been working together since. And so, I mean, despite coming from those very different backgrounds, we had the shared understanding, and that built to this very common approach to what I think Anup at first asked us to touch upon, which is just our approach to music in general, and what governs our process, and how we've gone about finding our own voices in music and in our own composition for film. So, I mean, the first things I think to touch upon was, I mean, there's always been, like you said, going down these rabbit holes, this shared motive to explore, to experiment, to deconstruct music and what our idea of music is.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's several things there, isn't it? I think definitely. I think so. I mean, ideas of sort of what deconstruction is, from my angle, just to sort of maybe to clarify, is that, again, it's probably linked to having gone through that classical process and then taking it to a different direction, which is commonly perhaps unusual behavior with my instrument or something like that, to explore what a string can do or explore what the bow can do. People qualify it as extended technique at times, pushing the strings further than you think they can go by way of using a technique which is discovered or invented, or you discover or invent, or doing things which seem at times perhaps like outlandish in a traditionally learned fashion. That definitely
so it's like
is there.
Breaking apart the techniques that you sort of learned as a classical musician.
Without, we're not saying you wouldn't use them, but there's a focus on the idea of unlearning things, saying, well, you've learned all this, then what if you dissect all this and see what the core is, and but not necessarily unlearning them, because I always use them, the things I learned before. But rather to sort of to dissect and deconstruct in a as a sort of creative process, I suppose.
I think also building on from, learning about classical music history, Western classical music history, also from what happened in the turn of the century, of moving away from tonal music, and understanding just what is music, and deconstructing that idea is something I think that we both had in common right from the onset. I mean, we were both sort of exploring when we met, which also helped with exploring and finding new sounds and new ways of creating music for back on the roots. Was the space of like, where does sound, which is something I was always interested in right from the beginning, tinkering around on my computer as well, sampling and experimenting with computer composition, was that where does sound end and where does music begin? I mean, is a car engine music? Is I don't know, the shutting of a door or the opening of a door? the sound of anything really.
Yeah.
What is music? Where does that start? What would you qualify as musical?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's there in what we do an awful lot, and I think again that from my that's there in that sort of the whole 20th century of Western style of composition. I suppose that's there, like you're saying.
Yeah.
When you take away tonality and you have experimental sonic forms being valid forms of music, whatever music means to anybody, and important for me and you, but personally just really important, has always been that link to musique concrète. And in the mid 20th century, the rise of, in the 40s, the rise of recorded sound of almost any kind being used as a building block to make bigger soundscapes, which are interpreted as music. The big movements in France in the 40s or whatever, but leading on into studio composition, the way film composition works for us, sampling, hip hop, and all these things, that's a personal thing I've always kind of loved the idea of. And that route for me, for that classical world, and working with you as a composer, there's a lot of heavy emphasis on studio work. Quite liberating, actually, coming from in some ways, it almost felt like it was quite a natural jump to be working in contemporary classical music, to jump into studio composition and film composition, but quite liberating, because if you're making all these sounds, it's extremely difficult to write down, to notate. As a composer works, you write down what it is you want to try and do to get that thing I did yesterday. Now that's a wonderful skill in itself, but it's also extremely liberating to just say, press record, and we capture that, because we're never going to get it again. It'll change next time, or we'll gradually get it again through a process of learning and repetition, but which isn't what we will always want to do. But so that studio composition and recorded work, and the studio as a tool, is a really interesting thing for me.
Definitely. I think that was entirely my entire background. So you wanting to explore that was something that we immediately connected with, and something we've used a lot in our work. And just even with going back to deconstruction, the idea of, like, in a very simple way also, just like looking at instruments and saying, how do we break this apart? What's another way we can approach this? What's another way we can get a sound out of this that might be new and unusual, and also change the way we write? Like, for example, I think with Newton, and I think it's something we did at Tackle in Yellow Boots as well, was to put bits of cardboard in between the strings and the bridge of a guitar, which then leads it, the strings can't quite sound out so much. It almost sounds like a marimba or something, like a strange kind of cardboard marimba string, weird hybrid of an instrument. And that totally changes the way you write. The way you, as a guitar player, at least, it would change the way I'd work with the guitar. And open up these very new, exciting avenues to both explore perhaps music with a slight different parts of Africa, the root, as well as, just another way that you start exploring your instrument. You changes the way you play. I think we did that then. And also, where does sound and music end? I think even in terms of a ideating process for Dackle and Yellow Boots, we were using since we needed to get into the psychology of this character who was quite disturbed, we were using tinnitus as a musical instrument. I mean, you realize that with an electrical guitar. But the founding thought was, like, if we were to use this ringing sensation that you get when you're extremely stressed, how would we turn that into, like, a compositional element in the score?
I mean, and that sort of takes us into the I think one thing we've touched upon before, is the idea of attempting to search for a newness in some of that discovery of what we're doing, whether we achieve it or not. But I mean, like the guitar thing, it could sound like something from another country to somebody else. That sounds a bit like my thing from where I'm from, or it could just sound a bit unrecognizable, and it takes us into a world of being like, well, never heard that before. That's interesting. And that gives us something original to sort of latch onto to start the process.
Well, it could be like, I'm thinking about Suku's music from the Congo, or it could be that I'm not quite sure what
sounds like bicycle spokes. You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
exactly.
It could be,
Yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
could be, it sounds like
Yeah,
a bird
yeah,
hammering a tree. I know it's actually a guitar
yeah, yeah,
being, you know,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and those perspectives can change for us as well. You know, that gives us a lot of juice to kind of to as a springboard. You know,
yeah,
to I don't know. It's those discoveries and those kind of that wish to look for something. Whether we achieve, whether anyone achieves anything that's exactly new is a different
yeah.
philosophical question. But to at least make the effort to be looking for something which is a little bit less easy to characterize in sort of a historical setting necessarily. So we
Sure,
have,
sure.
and that's not to
It becomes a
newness for the sake of newness. That's newness for the sake of the challenge, you know, and
yeah.
original sound for us, you know.
And also just in terms of
Excitement.
writing, because as a guitar player, you tend to sometimes fall into certain patterns in the way you just play or things that come to you easily. And suddenly when you do this, it feels like you have a new instrument in your hands.
Yeah,
And you suddenly
yeah,
start doing things that you may not have thought of
yeah,
or would have done otherwise.
absolutely.
Um, yeah. And then that was one approach in terms of experimentation. The other, I think, which ties into our what perhaps you know immediately got us working together was a shared taste in very different kinds of music. And I think in our composition process, that's something that we found meld together, where I don't think we've ever, it's very rare that we started a project and said, okay, it'll be this genre of music,
Yeah,
it'll be this kind of score, okay, this is going to be a punk score, or this is going to
yeah,
be a I don't know, like a Mozart-ish kind of score, whatever.
yeah,
It's like, it's always been, okay, this will be all of these different things together that we find
yeah,
interesting. That let's take a little bit from there, let's take a little bit of this from there. It's
yeah,
melding together very different
yeah.
kinds of musics. What do you think?
Absolutely, and sort of, and they appear on the way as well at
Yeah,
really
yeah,
interesting times. They sort of
yeah.
they pop out at you 6 weeks in. You're like, that's a discovery, and that works really
Actually, yeah,
well.
that's a good point.
That's
That's a good point. It's not even, I don't think it's ever been a premeditated decision where it's like, before we're going to take this and this together and let's do it. It's just while we're doing it and discovering the world of the film,
yeah,
little bits start coming together and say, oh, that's quite cool. Let's
yeah,
a little Carnatic element from there.
yeah,
Do this from there. This makes sense. It's a little bit of incorporating music from the place, or
yeah,
it's connected to the journey of the character, or something like that. I think
yeah,
one example maybe, which perhaps we can play, is the theme from Soncheya,
yeah,
which
yeah.
had a couple of things going for it, which was it was a Western. Soncheya was a film about this dacoit in the Chambal Valley in the 70s, and following the trail of this one dacoit. So it was very much, it was subverting things in the genre, but it was set within the genre of the Western. So there was a certain doff of the hat to all the composers have done that, as well as also embracing some of the typical genre tropes musically in that style, but also drawn from the place and the which was close, this melting pot of different areas. And I think one thing that we found that worked, which was close by, was Rajasthan, and the call and answer between the vocalist and a violin player right in the beginning of a folk piece. We'd heard that and we were like, oh, that's really cool. That might be a little thing to pick up from.
Yeah.
And I think the other was, there's a key moment in the film later on where the lead character envisions this very different life for himself, and he's not a dacoit anymore, but perhaps someone who's leading a more comfortable life, and he's on this camel and sort of slowly waltzing, moving away, and that walk, I think, became that's a very key moment that the music had to reach to in terms of that character's theme. And then I think it was also a development of what the Western trope was, which is almost all built around the rhythm of a horse.
Yeah.
And it was like saying, okay, let's change that around to this film and change it to this slow, like off kilter waltz with a camel. Yeah. So anyways, we can just play that piece right now. Yeah. So coming
Mm.
back to the music concrete being a big influence for the both of us, and the
Mm.
idea of using the studio as an instrument, the
Yeah.
computer and the studio as an instrument, um, and the idea also, which you mentioned earlier, working by doing, not so
Yeah.
much writing, but actually doing and exchanging ideas.
Mm.
I think that's something that's been a big part of our working process and influenced our process and the kind of music we make,
Mm-hmm.
where we work a lot either together or by a distance. And usually
Yep.
when it's by a distance, when we're in different continents, it's like it's working in small cells. It's working by sending things back and forth,
Yep.
not necessarily on one musical idea as a whole, but also just trying very different ways where we can do that. But usually we're working in a small cell, sending it to someone else who takes it,
Yeah.
uses it as almost like little Lego pieces and builds it,
Yeah.
makes something else, sends it back, this back and forth
Mm-hmm.
process. What do you feel about that?
I mean, I think that's it's a fundamental kind of core of what we've done from the outset
Yeah.
of using material from the beginning of That Girl in Yellow Boots, where I didn't arrive in Mumbai for several months before we set foot in the room, but you
Yeah.
sent me a theme. I worked with the theme. I
Yeah.
sent you some other experiments on the viola.
Yeah.
We went back and forth like that. So there's that core
Yeah.
element, which is kind of, and then obviously jumping later, we're in the room together on many films, doing lots of stuff very intensively in the same studio. But there is
Yeah. And
something.
even then,
Huh?
sorry, carry on.
Well, there's
Now,
something very interesting about the distance and the international collaboration idea of kind of together and distant, which has kind of creatively and in a good way forced us into working a certain way and figuring things out a certain way, and not just for like one independent cultural collaboration. It was never really that. It was more that we had this work to do. So how are we going to do it? So we're going to exchange the stuff, and we're going to give each other the liberty to really manipulate what each other does at any one time. That sort of two individuals collaborating by giving each other the freedom to say, I have no
take
idea
with
what you'll
this.
do with this.
Yeah, take with this and do what you will.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the sense, and it's also, I think it's important to mention, that was like even with Yellow Boots, where I'd handed you a theme and you sent me these descending and rising viola harmonics, and then suddenly with that, I don't think either of us were thinking when I sent it to you, you sent it to me, that it was going to be, it was never a linear process where we were working on one single piece of music. It was always like, these are things that might go together well.
Yeah.
And then in putting them together, they make several different kinds of, several different pieces. It's never really, I mean, it is, there are of course films where a certain type of piece may call for a far more conventional approach where it's just notes on a page.
Yeah.
But more often than not, it's been this working by doing. Let me do this little bit, send it to you. Oh, cool, I can put that bit over here. Let me take that, let me send it to you. Oh, I can put that over here. And suddenly we end up with these blocks that we can use all over the motifs, I guess you could call them, but these little blocks that we can use all over the film and the composition process, make several different pieces out of one. It's kind of working on the whole at the same time, not on individual pieces, if that makes sense.
I mean, without going too far off course, is an interesting thing that you and I always discuss often at the beginning of the project is cracking the zone. It's become part of our sort of lingo, but is sort of a thing. We're like,
it's like world building. Yeah.
And sometimes it might be a theme, but also oftentimes it is like a little golden nugget that we're looking for, which is just kind of a zone thing. Could be just a chord, it could be like a strange thing with through a
sound
reverb or a sound weird, or just a melody with something different that but
I think it's kind of like, it's kind of like almost in a strange way, like decorating a house or building a world. It's not like, okay, the table will go over there, the chairs will go over there, this will go over there. It's like, hey, this is a nice little bit of furniture. I don't know where it's going to go. It might be nice to have. Oh, this is a nice painting. I have no idea where we're going to hang it, but it's cool. I think it fits within the whole film. That's going to work somewhere. And then we have all these different things, and we're like, okay, this is. I think, I mean, all of them are guided with a central course, which I think we'll touch upon later, of how we decide, or how we build these ideas from. What are the core? What's our thinking process? But I think in our working process, it's this. It's of these building these small little ideas and seeing where they can put them, rather than saying, let's do this one piece of music first. Let's build a world. Let's build a world.
And building that world as well allows you to really, for me, what I take away from it in a very positive way is to also allows you to kind of explode that world and to say, you know, if I take X and put it in place, but do this to it for B, I create something wildly different. But so you kind of have a through composition idea of everything is linked. It might be drastically different. And that's a really important thing, I think, for finding that world, because you can sort of run back on yourself and cross over your spaghetti against yourself, you know, in all manner of ways.
Yeah, it's very freeing. That's a really good point. It's very freeing because it makes the experimental process very early on in the composition not tied to the structure or the limitations of one piece of music. Right? So it's very easy then in that earlier stage, because you're building these little things that take idea, that suddenly you may hand me a chord progression or a musical theme or you know, just a sound or whatever, something that we exchange, which suddenly makes you see everything else in completely different light. And it's very easy then to course correct and not say, oh, but how do I fit that square into a circle with this piece of music that I've already made? Because it's also it's quite modular at that point in time, that it's very easy to reconfigure. And that, I think that helps a lot with finding the musical world for this film, because it's like you're building a world. Oh, this is the architecture of it. This is that funny little guy living in a cottage down there. This is whatever. And very easily it can suddenly change into something else. And you're discovering it as it goes on. Putting these little fragments together. I think one interesting way that we did that actually was with Ship of Theseus. Just as a, I mean, I don't think we ever did it again, but we discovered very early on that the sound of, which we explored a little bit in our previous film, which we mentioned in Yellow Boots, but here it was far more, was this feeling of, I mean, these harmonics, right? These viola harmonics moving up or down a note, but almost just in tiny, tiny, small little phrases. This kaleidoscope of different phrases coming together. And I think the way we did it was we had this really extended, long couple of days in the studio,
hours
intense days, hours and hours, where you were just recording on the viewer with no idea of what the music was going to be. We didn't even have a single piece written by then. But like, okay, let's write, I think these unique small little phrases. Going up from this note to that. Here's this weird fall. Here's a weird gliss. Very strange sound. Again, going back to those deconstructed, extended techniques kind of things, like very weird sounds out of the viola. And I think we then sat and chopped each individual phrase up into a whole bunch of unique little phrases. I think we ended up with about, I think somewhere around 1800 or like, some ridiculously large number of like unique individual phrases. Like, so I could lay them out on a piano and just play all the phrases at once, and we both had that. So I had like whatever 1800 versions of you there playing.
Too many. Way too many.
And then that's eventually what led to that instrument that was sort of built, was what led to the musical world of Ship of Theseus. So of the film. Which I think we can maybe
let's
play a small piece. So I mean, these are those harmonics coming together and eventually forming this piece called Windmills. Yeah, so coming from that piece, I mean, I thought we could just show you the sampler, which was that these various samples would be on, I'm just playing a keyboard. So these are, each one of those is on its own key. So then you can sort of play it to create new pieces of music, which is
Becomes an instrument.
yeah. So then you have this entirely new instrument, and almost like a little mini ensemble playing immediately with these very specific phrases. So it was actually quite a fun way to put music together.
The other thing with all this is that, you know, it's you have a large use of kind of modular synthesizers as well. I'm interested in some synthesizers, but I'm not as experienced with synths themselves. But you know, that I'm interested in synthesis very much, and making sound out of, and so there's kind of, you know, making our own synthesizers almost. Essentially.
I mean, this technically wasn't a synthesizer. This was a sampler, but But yes, definitely. I mean, that's something that's been very interesting for me from the beginning, which is this intersection between technology and music, and building instruments, building hybrids of instruments like this, of you know, putting together things in different ways.
Yeah.
This involved like writing a script for contact, and making a contact sampler where this could happen.
Yeah. And also it's that kind
contact
of
is a sampling software.
Sorry. It's of course it's that live. It's that live. A bit like a sort of a live concrete idea as well, you know. It's a bit like that, which is interesting, which is definitely there.
And I think it's something that it's something that I was very intrigued by watching your improvised music. I mean, I haven't seen so many of them live, but seeing them on YouTube, and these other musicians, many of whom have built entirely new instruments, which have no connection to any known physical instrument before. It's a wire around contact mics which you tap and hit, make these strange sounds. And that was like hugely inspiring for me, which is like, you don't need to be bound by the physical constraints of a real instrument at all. Make anything. Make whatever you want to hear, you know.
Exactly. That's a really important point though, isn't it? It's like there's a world in certainly in Europe and United States, North America and places, and in that world of kind of free improvisation, where it's a big thing. There's like a big scene for very interesting artists who make their own instruments, and like you say, you know, it's like make what you want to hear, and also in that sense we try and write what we want to hear, you know, as the sort of guiding force behind a lot of our music making, you know. And
I think that ties into the different musics together, because then it's not really genre based or anything. It's just like from everything you like and everything you want to do and everything you've enjoyed hearing. What you want to hear. I suppose it's something to touch upon, but briefly is, I mean, we've been asked before in passing about the international nature of our collaborative work and working across different spaces and things. And that's never really been a thing. No, I've never seen it as like an international collaboration of people from
I think it's one of these things that it's interesting because we come from different places, but you know, that might be that it's interesting to come from a place within the same country, but it kind of stops there. You know, it's you know, we just I don't think it's personally, I don't think it's a sort of a defining thing, as the two
never been part of the conversation.
Backgrounds. Almost not relevant in that way. It's just so, you know.
Moving on from there, I guess, would be to just our general approach, which we touched upon a little bit already, but which is our approach to scoring and what guides our thought process and how we put music to picture. And I think the first, which is perhaps maybe a little obvious, is that I mean, the first thing which we both feel quite strongly about, and I think is been in scores we like and things that have inspired us, is to not spoon feed
Yeah.
In the sense, in a very simple or simplistic way, is to not spoon feed, but in a more building on from that is to ask very early on in the process and throughout the entire process is like, what role is music playing in this picture?
Yeah.
What are we adding to this that wouldn't have been there had we not added any music in, had there not been any music? So trying to I don't know, trying to do something that wouldn't have been achieved otherwise without the music there. So
Yeah.
what do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that is kind of huge for us in how we make the stuff. And that links into a lot. I mean, in earlier times, I think we've always sort of discussed the idea of less being more at times,
Sure.
Sometimes
Sure.
we made very, very full things and then just minus loads of stuff, or rud things out,
Yeah.
made very dense things and then made them very small. But I think let's link to that and saying, well, what if we try and think differently about it and try and, if how do we help the film and help collaborate with the film? How does the music sort of, as a narrator or potentially a narrator, collaborate with the film? How does it work together? What's the relationship?
What's that dialogue?
What's that dialogue? And also what is it that how do we want to assist in the listener and the listening and viewing experience without telling people what they should be listening and hearing and feeling? You know what I mean?
Or what they should be. I've always found that it's a little better to arrive just after someone, a listener, arrives at something themselves. If it's an emotional swap or a moment, as if it's so much more powerful that if it's something that makes you laugh or you cry or something, if you've already just got there and the music's with you after, but somehow it's not before and telling you, hey, you need to feel this. They make you realize it maybe subliminally, but then swelling just after you felt it yourself. It's very small. Maybe it could be just matter of like a half a second or something. But
I mean, there's an important thing I think for us maybe is that you're not. It's thinking about our role. It's very that's kind of the crucial thing is what is our role in that regard. I don't think we're there to manipulate. And it's that sort of the idea of saying, we're trying to how do we have a relationship with the listener and the viewer as well.
I mean I think that's it's I would obviously filmmaking is an art of manipulation. I mean ultimately, but I think it's like not manipulating in a pejorative sense. It's like it's more about storytelling than manipulation. It's about how do you take someone on a journey and make them feel or take them through an understanding of an idea or a world or a context or
I mean I think that the interesting thing there is how you let people, like you said about arriving just slightly after, is maybe our manipulation is allowing someone to make their own realization about what they just experienced.
And then very much so. I think
totally. That's what we were getting at.
Now you are coming here and you are going to feel this. Please look at that. What is sadness?
And
now we're going to go through the door to next phase, which is feeling a little better.
Is that kind of
basically I think it's about encouraging a more active experience. It's not so passive, as you're saying. And I think for me, the thing which has been a guiding principle, I guess, sort of, is thinking about it over time was, and not in a shocking sense, but is the sense of surprise and how important that is. And it's, I mean, maybe the unexpected is a better word, which is my father had always talked about this Russian art critic, and I think one of the first film critics called Viktor Shklovsky, and he described art or anything creative as the knight's move. You take 3 steps forward, 1 step to the left, and it's that 1 step to the left that makes you see things anew and discover new ways of looking at things. And that's essentially the role that anything creative has to do. And I think I see that as a really guiding, a strongly guiding principle in music. Primarily, it is to try and encourage a more active listening experience, which is that if you have a musical decision or a chord or a musical progression or an idea that's a little unexpected, that makes you as a listener, as a viewer, say, why?
Yeah.
Even if it's on a
Ask the
subliminal
question.
sense, like ask a question. It's like, why was that there? And that's interesting that was there, and that pulls you in a little bit more to like interact with the picture and have it say something to you and draw you in. It's like, what is that doing there? But it could be something, just an instrument choice,
Yeah.
or it could be something big in terms of like how the concept of the whole musical idea across the film is working.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
it
that's been
also can. Sorry.
No, okay.
It also can be the things you don't hear. You know.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
in that
absolutely.
really interesting way. So not even necessarily active recognition in orally speaking, so much as certain things which have just been placed, which you may or may not need to sort of acknowledge, which I find quite interesting. That sort of suggesting.
What do you mean?
We're just sort of suggesting ideas within ideas and stuff like that, and I think that's there in quite a lot of our writing, when there's some detail and there's layers in there which could be heard or don't have to be heard, but the importance of what's inside some of the music that is part of that, they are chains within there which kind of may affect how you ask questions or have certain realizations, or you maybe don't necessarily hear them. I think that's there in a lot of our writing as well. There's a lot of just I think we do kind of weave
undercurrents.
Weave a web with sort of certain types of undercurrents at times, which I think I've really enjoyed doing, but I think that's quite important for us as well. Yeah.
I mean, nebulous has a pejorative. I mean, it has a negative sound to it, but I think there's something to that where it's not. There's more than one thing going on.
Yeah.
It's which is not to say that things are unnecessarily complicated or complicated for the sake of complicating them, but it's very rare, anyways, that you're in a dramatic moment in a film or in a. There's certainly clarity of purpose. It's not to take away from that, but it's very rare that you're in a dramatic moment anywhere in life or in a story where it's just one clear thing.
Yeah.
At one time, it's just happiness. It's just sadness. It's always that mixing up of things, of making them several different strands at once, which makes it so much more human.
Yeah.
It's much more interesting. And yeah, there's more to break down, more to chew on.
Yeah.
And yeah. So I think, I mean, moving on from there, that builds on to what you were touching upon earlier, which is like, what is the role that the music needs to fill with relation to the film, which is, I guess in some ways it's guiding. I think I was working recently as a sound designer on another film with Chaitanya Tamhani, and he was talking about how his idea of sound design was more than the edit or the visual sound was how you guided the eye in a frame. It's like how for him sound was where you're looking. And I think it's the same with music in the sense that it's guiding your mind with like how you're thinking about it. It's like filling the soul of something. It's filling those things that are quite intangible that you couldn't quite put your finger on earlier, and how you're thinking about them and how you're encouraging people to think about them or to look at something. And within that context, I mean, there's many ways of that music can interact with the picture, several, and just touching upon some could be, I mean, I suppose one could be one of them, which we've done a lot, is a character study, which is especially on films which are exploring one person or people, is that what role can music play in teaching you things more about the character and filling that world of that person. And I think one example could be Newton. yeah, so that was the theme from Newton, and it was a film centered around this one character who was a sort of rookie government clerk who has this very simple, almost simplistic view of the world and this idea of what democracy is, and he's suddenly put into this very complicated situation where he has to conduct these free and fair elections in a guerrilla-infested Naxal area, and he comes up with the CRPF army general Atma Singh, who has a far more practical, pragmatic understanding of the world. And the film is primarily about how this simple idea of a free election and we must conduct elections, of this idea of democracy, and it was a black comedy against how this versus this very practical, pragmatic army general who sees that it doesn't make any point, the same people are going to get elected, elections are useless, how they come up against each other. And I think this piece of music was then an introduction to that character and perhaps his way of looking at the world, which is a bit simple and sweet but simple. And he had this very and I think the whole film also in his character journey sees the idea of how this very mathematically ordered and rigid understanding of the world descends into chaos. And this was the beginning of like introducing us to that. And I think that very quickly that the hope was that piece would teach you that very quickly about him and set the context of his character and what that journey would be. That's why we had this recorders and these kind of simple sounding instruments, as well as like this very like mathematically ordered percussion.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of we're trying to sort of find a certain kind of strict ideology, so with the mathematics alongside a sort potentially a naivety, you know, and innocence, and also quite a quirky individual because of his adherence to.
And I think that's that was both him and in keeping with the aesthetic of the whole film, which is this black comedy satire about elections. Yeah, cool. So I mean that was
and it's that slightly off kilter thing, which we also. It wasn't to say that it was, you know, that he was deliberately off kilter, but so much as that's with that guitar, with the way we treated that guitar, to find something slightly interesting, you know. Not sure I quite understand, you know.
This is touching back to earlier of putting bits of cardboard between the strings, so that was the guitar with the cardboard. Cool. I mean, I guess the other would be moving on from character would similar would be jumping more from a general character study, looking from the outside, to jumping within, where you're jumping into a character's mindset and how they think and exploring the inner psychology of a character. But I think that happened to us on our first film, which is where Anurag's brief for Yellow Boots was we need to really understand the psychology, the inner workings of a composer mind. Sorry, state of mind.
The state of mind composition sort of idea.
And that was you know this exploration of this girl who had just come in, was looking for her father, and she's young and she's come from the UK and she's in India, and she has to go through quite a torturous experience to find him. And has to deal with a lot of strife and difficulty, and is for a lot of the time quite stoned, smoking, and you know, quite anxious. So I think those two things, the two things that we're touching upon was one, this idea of tinnitus and exploring that as a musical instrument, and I think the other in terms of deconstructing the guitar was, I think, we used for this far away, lost in cotton kind of sound. We had a guitar and we'd hit the top of the guitar while holding a chord down. So you had this sound that echoed out from almost no contact. So it had this very disembodied, distant portrayal of a state of mind.
I mean, very much had its own character, you know. Those elements very much had their own sort of character, which kind of I think what was interesting about that, some of that music in the film that we achieved, was that they had such distinct characters in a very, but in sort of a once removed way. You're sort of hearing these things which you might hear if you have tinnitus, or if you weren't sure if you hear something at night, you know, some sort of feeling that you have. I think that was interesting with those particularly.
I think we can play maybe just the example of the hitting on the top of the guitar, just to hear what that sounds like. That disembodied, stuck out of the world kind of sound and feeling. So you can play that example.
Cool. Yeah, so that was the music from Yellow Boots. I think another really interesting time we had with this similar sort of area of being inside someone's mind in both sort of a state of mind and also in an experiential sort of sense was getting deep into the composing of one particular piece in Ship of Theseus, the confusion sort of montage scene. And how did we create the world of a blind photographer who was having this very new and overwhelming sensory experience in a very busy part of Mumbai. I think that was to do with state of mind and the experience and the potentially like what your ears and eyes and shadows are.
Yeah, I mean, the film was about a blind photographer, someone who worked just by sound and framing images, and then who suddenly in this moment undergoes a procedure where she can see again.
Yeah.
So this is the first time where she has to go out with a camera to a very busy intersection in Mumbai and is sort of overwhelmed with this sensory delight, and then really doesn't know how to process and doesn't know where to look and what to photograph anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, in that piece, I think one of the other main things in the film, which really governed a lot of the sonic choices, especially early on, was this feeling of there was a lot of ideas exchanged, and it was always people trying to wrestle with the way they looked and thought about the world. So there was this feeling of like neurons almost firing off of like these different little, and that tied in quite well with this character was looking and seeing things for the first time. So that was that. At least personally, that was that. In the beginning of the piece, this little. I don't know how to describe them. Little sparks.
Yeah, like with the glistening elements, and again working with the sort of things, the way we've been sampling as well.
Yeah.
And there's those sort of things which were just darting around in your mind suddenly for the first time,
And also the idea of collaboration, because I think that was a chance where we had to work with some really brilliant musicians, and that has Alex Ward, the clarinetist, playing on that, who also, I mean, in some really very unusual ways to play the clarinet. Which was quite a lot of fun, and it was a huge learning experience for me to hear and see that happen. Moving on from there, I think another thing which we end up doing quite a lot is building a sense of mood and a sense of place, and almost like a sense of atmosphere, where in the music can build a world along with everything else in the film, which is almost like I think fog almost that
Yeah.
hangs over everything. And I think one of those was Killa, where that atmosphere was one of like nostalgia, almost wistfulness. There was this sense of discovery and many other things going on. But Killa was this film about this young child who's had to move um, into a new place. I think shortly after he's lost his father, and makes this new group of friends and goes through this huge learning experience. And Killa means fort in Marathi, and it's also about how he moves out of the fort he set up personally within himself, and learns to move beyond boundaries he has and boundaries he discovers when some of his friends in the course of the film not betray but perhaps abandon him. So this scene was a moment quite early on in their friendship, when it's this budding friendship, when they go out to the sea to collect crabs. And I think in what we touched upon earlier, in the sense of surprise, or in the sense of making things more active experience and having more than one idea going on at the same time, I think perhaps one of the first approaches to this film could have been that it's this quite sweet moment of these kids discovering crabs and going around. But it was, I think, one thing that we needed to hide in there, or to build in there, which was really important, especially in making this an emotional experience for someone watching it in a more complex, active way, was this sense of sadness, of almost like of a world gone by. And that was that feeling of nostalgia, which built that the atmosphere through that entire film. What do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, and that was definitely something where we were working with the idea of that sort of beginning trajectory right through to the very last moment, and I think that what happened with that in sort of working with the ideas of elements of nostalgia, and I mean, it's maybe a child discovering something which is has that sort of, in another way, a nostalgic element, but also being there for part of how he discovers the world, and then has to leave that world, and have his own version of that nostalgia realized, as he drives away, potentially
right at the end,
and having to build the music right from the beginning through, and many different permutations in different ways through the film, different settings, and in every setting I think we sort of really looked at that. What are those zones to encapsulate those elements, that till that quite large peak at the end, of just that kind of the memory that we see at the end of the film.
So the end of the film has him eventually leaving this place and moving on, and so in the sense that nostalgia is not just it worked in two ways, where it was not just the nostalgia of any adult or anyone who wasn't the character's age watching this and thinking back to a lost time of being a child like that, but also of him, the character, looking back on himself, of the character right at the end. So written in early on, before you know it, is the character already almost living this film as a memory.
And having to, as he drives away, having to see that and experience that, however we,
and that having that early on built all the way through, then eventually made that swell and that catharsis at the end all the more powerful. Hopefully, Did
you hear the crabs?
So this is hunting for crabs, Killa.
Cool.
Another point could perhaps be the music embodying the philosophy of a film, the worldview, and trying to find how the music can help make that clearer. And there are a couple of examples. I mean, there are many examples of that, but I mean, one would be, I think, Chintu Ka Birthday, where it was a story of this family trapped in Iraq after the war and during the war, and they can't go back home, and they're trying against all odds. Everything seems to go wrong of trying to celebrate the young boy's birthday. Last year it couldn't happen because they couldn't get a cake, and this year when they're trying to do it, they keep running into obstacles. And one of them is where they, the cake that they're trying to get ready burns, and so ultimately, I felt the film was about the inheritance of hope, of this father slowly teaching his son how he can learn to hope, how he can hope even in the most trying and difficult of circumstances. And it ends with the son in a very beautiful, touching moment. You realize that the son has got it too, and feels the same way, despite everything going wrong. And the way there were these moments early on when the cake burns and all, for example, where there was one of the first choices of music could have been to score how that was a difficult and trying moment. But we realized the music had to embody that hope right from the beginning, and it had to have that sense of positivity, of pushing through. So the music never ever scores anything quite so negative. It's always trying, more often than not, trying to in a moment of difficulty to score, to not empathize with how trying the circumstances are, but instead portray the father's worldview, which is like to score resilience and hope and perseverance. Another perhaps would be Ship of Theseus, with the first example we played earlier on, not this one, but Windmills, where the film was talking about this idea of an identity, of where do you draw the limits between yourself and the world around you? Where do you draw the limits between yourself and the organisms living within your body, with an ant on the ground? Where do you start and where does everything else begin? And is it all the same thing? And what parts make up who we are? And I mean, a lot of thought. I think we spent a year on that score, but a lot of thought went into thinking about how does the musical world capture that? And one was this kaleidoscope, like you heard in the previous piece also, of like these different ideas and these different things all sparking off the other. And the other idea was a sense of scale, a sense of awe, of vastness, of like almost a sense of scale where it's both microscopic and large at the same time, where there's slow waves of time, where it's am I looking at a world from planets away, or am I looking at a world through a microscope? And somehow, I don't know if it's successful in doing that, but trying to capture that, both of that flux of both of those things at the same time, sense of awe and time.
I think it's worth mentioning in that same regard the end piece, a bit like we did with Killer. And I think I think we kind of had to think like that as well to the end piece, where we go and meet the end piece of the blind photographer story. In the mountains, where we go and experience that reality of that vastness, and that also, and the potentially the insignificance of life forms within that vastness when you compare yourself to a giant Himalayan peak. I think that's kind of a similar thing where we had to think in that trajectory. How do we get up to that top bit, whilst not making it overblown? How do you create great space and scale?
I think it's like it was both. Exactly. It was how do you create a sense of scale and awe with quietness and quietude, and also understanding your place within that awe. So I think it had to have both. How do you create awe without it being grand? How do you, without it being like big and huge, but have a sense of quiet to it too, and introspection, but awe. I think we can maybe play a tiny clip of that. I mean, we played Windmills, the piece of that earlier. Play a small clip just so it connects back to that point.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think other areas that I think we find interesting and that we've been able to jump in quite deeply into is that sort of is this the unfolding story. I think Gurgaon is a really interesting example of this.
Mm,
How we sort of went through different permutations of composed ideas to find the composition to become more about the storytelling across the entire tale. So almost being a folk tale happening in musical form, a bit like in a Greek chorus, or a bit like in folk theatre or other kinds of theatre.
yeah,
Coming back all the way through, commenting on what's happening in real time and what has happened, as well as emphasizing the actual the tale of the sort of dark tale. But is that sort of, are you sitting comfortably, then we'll begin, and sort of following through from the beginning to the end with elements of poetry, and which we then scored into ideas of sort of abstract song ideas, through regular instrumental scoring and modern music all intertwined. But that kind of role of music as narrator almost,
yeah,
which is an
yeah,
interesting area. It's not always what we need to do.
yeah,
In some context, it's like, how do
yeah,
we make the music a character
yeah,
in itself, or an
yeah.
overriding voice kind of thing.
Yeah, watching over the story unfold
Yeah,
and telling you.
yeah.
Yeah, like a Greek chorus. Yeah, very
Mm.
much. I mean, that was the thought process behind it, and it's also then interesting tying back to the earlier point of like drawing from folk traditions or traditions outside of music or film,
Yeah,
which is the traditions in theater,
yeah, absolutely.
folk storytelling.
Yeah.
Gurgaon, just for context, was a film about set in the suburb of Gurgaon around Delhi, where it followed around the story, which was also talking about the genesis of how that place came up, and also within this internal family drama of a brother that gets his sister kidnapped.
Mm.
But it's also tying back to a long history
Yeah.
of the way women, the role women may have to play in
Mm.
societies like that, which is
Mm.
not very much. And in that film, you don't see very deliberately, you don't see the agency of that woman
Mm.
for a long time.
Mm.
And so it felt quite interesting for this Greek chorus to be female,
Yeah.
watching on and
Yeah.
commenting on this story as it did. And that's why we had these abstracted bits of song and poetry interspersed across the entire film as the tragedy sort of unfolds.
Yeah. I think what also was particularly interesting about that as well was the idea of sort of taking very more antiquated or old traditions of folk tale storytelling,
Yeah,
theatre,
yeah,
and folk music as well, which does tell those tales,
yeah,
into like an ultra modern world.
yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
the most modern, burgeoning world you can imagine. That was a very interesting
Which
process.
was which was also very much the story of the film, which was
Yeah,
this
exactly.
old world crashing into
Yeah,
into the new, and both of them not really knowing what the hell to do with each other.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, cool. Moving on, the other is more, and there's more. I mean, there's so many more ways, and that's, I think,
Yeah,
part of the exciting process. Is there's always these exciting new ways that one can find, and new ways that music can interact with film, and it's always exciting and an ongoing investigation to discover new ones. And
mm,
some of the more obvious ones, I think, perhaps are just the role music has to play in the structure and pace of a film, which is
yeah,
of which is a big decision. So where one needs music and where one doesn't, of like
yeah,
the pace of like how fast do you want a film to flow, how
mm,
where do you want to pause, where do you want to reflect, where do you want to hurry through,
mm,
where do you need to move on from one place to another, um, and where do you need catharsis, where do you need release, where
yeah.
do you need tension.
And do you need
um,
music?
yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah. I think
if
one of
not,
a funny story, sorry, just remembering, was with Yellow Boots. We'd scored the entire film practically, and you had to leave for back to England. And
yeah,
we just seen Anurag very excitedly called us in. Come on, so show you the new edit, and like we saw a new version of the film, where I think it wasn't a very significant change. I think the beginning had been restructured, some things had been moved around, But we lost in that restructuring and in that trimming. I think maybe 5 or 6 minutes of the film had gone, which is quite normal. I mean, it happens through an ongoing editing process. But in the context of this edit, radically changed the pace of the whole film. And suddenly, where we'd had felt like a slower film, where it felt like the music needed to be more active in bringing us in and moving us from one place to the next, suddenly you had this film where music needed to have an almost opposite role in like in quietude, like slowing things down and introspection. And I remember us going to a bar after that and having a glass of wine. I mean, a glass of beer, wine, I don't know.
Yeah.
And it was a bar right near the film office, and saying, "Oh wow, it's a new film." And we pretty much threw out the entire score and rewrote the whole thing because suddenly, even though I mean, there were a lot of things with the character study, etc., and the idea of tinnitus that we mentioned earlier that stayed on. But in a more functional sense of how music, the pace of certain parts suddenly needed to change, and those more pacey moments that we'd written were not required anymore.
Absolutely,
and it's like, oh god, now we need to slow down.
Yeah.
But sorry, you were coming to silence.
Well, yeah, potential silence.
Yeah.
And making that choice to say, I mean, we've been in the situations before, in different situations where we've got potentially very dense music, and we've taken lots of it away, or rubbed lots of things out, or just ditched chunks of it, where we all agree. But like, we've also got like, silence. What if we don't have any music? You know.
Yeah.
And taking that call is important.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think one example of that would be Harud, which was this film set in Kashmir, where it was about this young boy and his family, and he's discovering photography through. But it's primarily about how his brother has disappeared, and this investigation into militancy there, and like, I think one overriding feeling and or throughout the entire film is a sense of oppression, being trapped, not really having any recourse, not being able to do anything. And I think there were many moments which could have had music through the film, and that was an ongoing discussion that we had with Amir Bashir and Shankar Raman, who were the director and cinematographer of the film. And I think we eventually decided that the not having any music and that silence created that sense of oppression and that sense of claustrophobia and of no recourse, that and no release, that music would have allowed for. Because immediately, as soon as we felt that as soon as music entered anywhere, it punctured that, and it didn't allow for that to build. And it eventually builds to a moment at the end of the film where you have this very, quite tragic moment where someone passes away, a key character passes away. And then when the music plays there, it acts as this, it's almost cathartic after that.
Huge release. An embodiment of sort of an attempt at an embodiment of pain, you know.
Tied to actually, which was what Amir Bashir had wanted, was that he'd that some traditional ceremonies where at a funeral a woman wails, almost screams out in anguish after someone's passed away, and it was trying to capture that musically at the end, and having that without any music before made it far more powerful. So that silence sort of built up as the music towards that end last piece. Maybe we can play just the beginning of that turn, that embodiment of that funeral that we were talking about.
Yeah, one thing Anup had asked us to talk about was the nature of the industry, and what it's
Mm.
like being composers, young composers in this current scene, having also done almost 11 years solid together in it as
Mm.
well. Um,
Mm.
you know, the changes we've seen or not seen, and what it's like. You know, um,
Yeah.
uh, I suppose there's probably lots. I mean, there's the
Yeah.
relevance, as we've talked about a lot, the relevance of song and song and score as different entities.
Yeah.
A lot of
Definitely.
in film composition. You know.
Yeah. I mean, I think earlier on, I mean, something that just changed perhaps a lot, uh, especially for theatrical film, had this relevance as a marketing device, where it would be something that needed to exist quite strongly outside of the film,
Yeah.
and was more had to sell the film. So
Mhm.
it was almost like an advertisement for the film. So that sometimes would end up in a situation where the musical world and the world of the song could be quite different from the world of the film, and then
Yeah.
you might have these songs sort of shoehorned into a film. And I
Mm.
think throughout, I mean, we haven't worked on so many of those projects, but
Mm.
we've seen through around us and working where their films easily where the song is integrated the into the film,
Mhm.
or doesn't have any songs at all. And I
Yeah.
think what that's done for us is it's allowed us to explore songwriting as a
Mm.
device within film, where the song isn't necessarily bound by any of those decisions,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to be catchy or something that would work in a marketplace, but can work
Yeah.
purely in a more soulful way with the context of the film, which I think we had the opportunity to do with Newton.
With Newton.
But
Yeah.
there's a song that plays in the middle of the film,
Yeah.
maybe towards the end during the
And
election.
Gurgaon,
Yeah, and Gurgaon, which
you
we
know,
touched upon, where we can then suddenly break apart a
in
song
a
and look at a
very
song in
abstract
a
way.
very abstract way, which
Mm.
is, it's not even really, I mean, it's not, I don't know if you'd call it a song, as more like sung poetry, but yeah,
Yeah.
there were lots of songs in Gurgaon as well, which weren't, I mean, I don't think the songs you'd sell or hear on radio, primetime radio or
Yeah.
conventional radio play. Yeah,
But it allowed us
that's
to,
quite freeing.
to explore the
Yeah,
song
it's very freeing.
context as score, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
and explore the songwriting in a very different way.
yeah.
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 And it's also, I think what happens sometimes with films that have songs in very prominent moments is you then hopefully you can build everything into an organic whole, but
Hmm.
sometimes it robs you of that opportunity, and also the opportunity to develop the relationship between thematic material and picture in a more holistic way, and also with more depth, because inevitably songs usually end up playing in at the apex of dramatical moments in a film,
Mm.
which is where you perhaps want a theme in its fullest form
Yeah.
and its strongest form. And
Yeah.
if it's a song, you either have the musical identity of the rest of the film has to be uh, you know taken from that song,
Yeah.
or draws from that song, or is completely different. But here you have a chance to weave a more intricate tapestry of how you build those ideas, and also
Yeah.
have the chance for musical themes to have a far more deeper connection with the audience, where they've built with them, stayed with
Mm.
them for so
Mm.
long, and then when it comes in at a strong moment, there's so much more of a stronger payoff.
Yeah.
What do you feel?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think we've had experiences, I think, in films where certain things, certain very big moments in films like Sancheria, Lal Kaptan,
Yeah, yeah,
have with these peak moments, sort of peaks and
yeah,
troughs. And those are
yeah,
moments which we've been able to then really make something where we want to go at times massive, or we want to go
yeah,
really big there, able to do that. Um,
yeah,
or like we were talking about earlier on, is working through the trajectory of the music right to the end, like in things like
yeah,
11, where that
yeah,
moment potentially could be a sort of a song setting. Is that sort of
yeah,
the right sort of space for it?
yeah,
As is the bike race moment,
yeah,
but we were able to create something which sort of re-explore what that might be.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I think that's been important. Um, I think we've seen a development in how maybe some of the industry approaches score. And with the change
I
in
think especially
web series as well, I think that's
yeah. I mean, I think especially with web series and also with perhaps a change in just looking at the craft of what music can do to a film.
yeah,
Web series obviously I think frees to some extent frees this looming specter of the opening weekend for theater. So there's
yeah,
not this expectation that everyone has to get the film immediately, everyone has to get it and understand it, in at least
yeah,
in whatever we've worked on. So there's an opportunity and also a general shift, maybe in a trend
mm,
where scoring is not seen as communication as much. I think that
yeah,
was something that we'd seen in some projects, especially larger projects much earlier on,
yeah,
where producers are involved and there's concerns about how an audience might consume something. It's like, will they get it? And
yeah,
there's maybe not, I don't
yeah,
want to call it insecurity, but there's the music starts to fill a role of making things clear.
yeah,
And sometimes not at the cost, but the it's not so much within the context of building the world or telling the story of what's best for the film
mm,
in the long sense. It's more like we need to make it more clear. We need to make it more obvious, and ends up becoming became sometimes the overriding conversation of
yeah,
how what the music needed to fulfill. And now I don't know. I haven't seen that much
mm,
anymore. It's been more conversations about what is this world, what are these characters,
yeah,
what are we trying to tell, what is the story we're trying to say. I
mm-hmm,
mean, what is the director trying to do? And it's been more
yeah,
conversations about that, which has been great. It's really freeing to not have to speak to or answer to people who aren't in the room,
yeah,
who's people you don't really know, and maybe who don't even really exist. This
yeah,
fictional larger audience, do they get
yeah,
it or not? I think I mean, it's nice to respect the audience and expect everyone to hopefully, if you're doing your job right, communicate, be on the same page as you.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Mm.
what do you think?
Yeah, and I think that's a valid assertion. The idea that you obviously are trying to make something that people will hear and want to hear, see,
Yeah,
but without having to put it without having to pander, without having to
yeah,
say one must do this because and
yeah,
that's there in film music and other musics, and other music and performance. That's there in
yeah,
performance, and people have to say, you want to make the performance. You want people to come to the performance, but you also need to
yeah,
make the performance that you want to make. Like the filmmaker
yeah,
wants to make the film that they want to make, hopefully, you know.
yeah,
So there's that kind of being able to sort of cling onto that and kind of really grab hold of that and run with it. It's
yeah, yeah. I
yeah,
mean, I perhaps I have to rephrase myself. Hearing it's like not. It's not. Perhaps everything's trying to communicate, but
yeah,
it's you don't have to make things obvious,
yeah,
which ties
exactly.
back to that spoon feeding. Yeah,
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 and it
yeah,
allows us to challenge. It
yeah,
allows us to actually, well, what if we go a bit? Well, if we try this, it's going to be really
yeah,
interesting. You know,
yeah,
and it allows that challenge to come from
yeah,
our side potentially, um,
yeah. It
which is a
definitely allows a lot more space for the score to interact in very different ways with
yeah, yeah,
the picture. Yeah,
which in a sort of a changing industry is also very. You need that to remain driven to make good creative work. It's very
yeah,
important for the process.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, I think. Mm.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think the next point, moving on from that, which Anup had asked us to touch upon, which is the changes that we'd like to see or how we like to work. Or I
Mm.
think, I mean, what we'd envision is hopefully a better world for scoring. I think one of the main things for me is been hoping for just appreciating a respect for scores as their own entity,
Yeah.
which I think is primarily driven with I mean, it's fostered with this would be fostered with just releasing scores
Yeah.
and having them out there. And I'm not talking about scores now in modern times, but especially about the history of music
Yeah.
and music made from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all building up to now. There's such a rich tradition of
Mm.
film
Mm.
scoring music in India, and we have so much and such a loving relationship with like all the songs of the 50s and 60s, but we don't hear the scores. We don't hear the
Yeah.
scores of the 70s and 80s. They're incredibly hard to find. And I
Mhm.
don't know whether that responsibility lies with the gatekeepers of who has the rights and who owns them, or whether it's just about releasing them and hopefully not educating, but creating a culture of like
Yeah.
appreciating them and hearing them
Yeah.
and listening to scores in their own right. There are a few which became notorious, and funnily enough, they've become, there are some albums of hip hop producers
Mm.
sampling funk scores from the 70s
Right.
and 80s outside of the country, but there's not so much of it. I don't see so much of it here.
Yeah.
Which would be, I think, quite lovely because there's
Yeah.
such a long, very rich history and tradition of it. Um,
Because
and
I think,
this is music not just across Bollywood, but of course across Bengali cinema and
yeah.
cinema in from the south of India, from Tamil, Kannada, everything, Malayalam.
Yeah, when you think of the amount, I mean, the amount of the hugeness of the industry and then the collective
Yeah,
industries when you put them together,
yeah,
um, because I think that there's an interest outside of India from other people in other countries in that
yeah,
world of work and listening, and I mean, the sound of the films is always talked about by
yeah,
people that I know, and and I think that's the thing which would be, yeah, it'd be great to see a lot of that material just out in its own right, seen for the sort of the scale and scope of what it takes to make a big soundtrack. Um,
mm,
you know, I often feel that it's very important, like you say, that I think I approach things a little bit like thinking like it is always an entity in its own right anyway. Of
mm,
course we match it to picture, and of course it's inherently forever linked to the project that we've been making it for, but i think I don't think we go into it thinking that it's also not its own thing.
yeah. It has to stand on its own feet as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I think we
definitely.
always
Yeah,
would go into something thinking, well, how do you listen to it, how do you
yeah,
hear this piece or this cue or this overall thing. And I think that if that's
definitely.
there as part of our creative process,
Yeah,
that's an
yeah.
important
It's
thing
a
for the
question I get
collective
asked.
ears.
Yeah, it's a question I get asked quite often. Is that
Yeah.
when if I've introduced myself as a composer for, I'm not usually say I make music. So say I make music for film, and someone says, "Oh, that's cool. Like, what do you? And what about music for yourself? What about your
Mhm.
own music? What do you do?" I don't know. I feel like, yeah, no, but that is my own music.
Yeah.
That is. It's not.
Yeah.
I think there's a tendency sometimes to see it as such a technical craft,
Mm.
and not which I think is actually something we have in common. We don't have a
Yeah.
romanticized version. Sorry, complete aside, we don't have this romanticized version of the artist or anything. We see it as a craft as well,
Of course.
but it's seen as like a very technical thing sometimes, and not like a creative process in its own right.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think there's a sort of I think it would be nice in film or in general if people do sort of see that, there's collaboration between you and I, and then us collaborating with the director or
yeah,
company or whatever,
yeah,
you know, forms so much creative work worldwide that it's maybe sometimes there's a prejudice in people's minds if you're working with, or sometimes to for
for yeah,
a group of
yeah, yeah,
people, it's not
yeah.
as much your
It's
own
not your own.
as,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
but it's actually remarkable amount of most work created usually
yeah,
is collaborative,
yeah,
usually is ensemble or a number of
yeah,
people, or if there's an
yeah,
orchestra, it's a conductor and 100 other people, and
yeah.
then the stage managers and the concert manager, whatever.
Or even the history of
Um,
Western classical music was always written for someone.
yeah, written for someone, and often
Yeah,
chamber music, and often
yeah,
a vast amount of music written wasn't solo. It's quite
yeah,
rare
yeah,
to have purely solo music. It's not very,
yeah,
very common. So I think that sort of redefining in people's thoughts that it's as much yours if it's as it is if it was
yeah,
just alone or something like that. I think that's important.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And I think another one is perhaps also just maybe, I mean, it's a change we've been seeing anyways. It's something that's been happening is usually sometimes as composers you're parachuted into foreign territory, right at the end of a project. It's like, oh, I have to figure it out and get it done very quickly and still acquaint yourself with the new world. But it's nice, and especially I think with streaming, because of the long timelines it takes to get something done, and because it's such a longer process, there's so much more to do, that you get involved quite early in the process, quite early on. And I think we've seen that with films as well, which is I don't know if it's a change in the industry, but it's a change we've been experiencing, which is really nice, which is that you get a chance to then have much more of a conversation with the film, even before it's shot, and sometimes even in the process of its writing, to write music then. And then there's so much more, just on a more practical level, there's so much more time to experiment. But also there's just so much more of a conversation, which is great, In fact, I feel like it's sort of best on both extremes. Obviously, there's ways to find wonderful ways of working in every situation, but it's best to be involved right in the beginning, where you have this chance for interaction, or almost right at the end, with a locked cut.
And it's very clear.
It's very clear. The edit in the film totally speaks to you in a very clear way, and you can get it. Right. Somehow it's just, I think we had that with Killa, we had that with Newton. And with Newton, we were given a locked cut with no music in it at all.
Which was
great.
What a gift.
Which is very freeing. And I think that's the thing, that it frees you from the temp score.
Absolutely. And the difficulty of navigating those temp scores, I mean, as there's many score composers will attest,
So a temp score, for someone who's not familiar with the term, is the score that might be placed while editing, just to get an idea of the feel for the film. So it's usually music from other films, or music from just any music at all. And inevitably there are some trends of what happens around that time, where you get famous bits of music from famous films going into the score, or other bits. And what ends up happening is purely because someone may have been editing, or some people may have been editing for a long time, is when you just watch something many times over, it really starts to inform the editing choices, and it also informs it sort of just melds and fuses into the film, because you've watched it so many times, they just become a thing. And then when you're involved later on, and you haven't, it can limit you a little bit. And it's also then becomes quite difficult to envision a different version, if you have a different version, or to push things out, because then it becomes a thing of what I think a term you often used is like fitting a square into a circle.
Definitely. The square into the circle, and navigating that.
So I think it's always so wonderful to be involved much earlier on, where the temp can actually be music you've written for the film, which then allows for so much more dialogue.
I mean, there's and when you're able to write things before it's shot, you actually then you have a real potentially positive influence on how the other departments are thinking at the same time, rather than being quickly at the end, get the music done. Like that's quite hard. So like that's really nice when that happens. Which we've definitely.
I mean, it's so much more easier when it's right at the end, when you get this lock cut, because then it's clear, the choices are clear, and with no music, that's like Then I mean, if the directors, if there's that time and the directors wants to explore that option, so it's a lot of fun.
I mean, that I think has also been linked to the same sort of working process, where when we've been very lucky, I think, in working with lots of directors that who've come to us for the things that we do, and that's something I would hope for, is that people do go to composers for the things that you bring to it. And when a director has, like you say, a locked cut with no temp, and they come to you because they want to see what you're going to do with it, that's a really nice position to be in creatively as well. And in terms of trust in the relationship with the director and producer, sure. In that sense, that's important to me.
Yeah, and I think something that we've seen also in all of this changing, and the shift from song the
Mm.
songs eat up usually a very large percentage of the budget,
Yeah.
is the opportunity then with which we've seen on some especially more recent projects, is
Mm.
where you're given the resources to say, like,
Yeah.
you have now the opportunity to work with an orchestra, you have the
Yeah.
opportunity to work with a lot of time, resources, both in terms of money, as well as in terms of budget, as well as in terms of time, if you have the
Mm.
opportunity to explore and really do things. And I think there was a tendency more early on sometimes where I've heard stories of friends and colleagues on other projects where they've discovered the budget for curtains in the set design was more than the score. The entire music. So I mean, it's hopefully with seeing it less as communication, more about storytelling, and such an integral part about storytelling. It also allows for more resources and more of a chance to think on a larger canvas.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's all that we've touched upon. Yeah. So many thanks to Anup Singh and Sunny Gill for inviting us to do this.
Thanks a
And
lot.
yeah, that's us. Yeah.